Can you view the full screen of
Yes,
my?
we're all set. We're good.
Great, thanks. All right. Hello, everyone. I am Disha Gupta. I'm an assistant professor at the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research, which is in Mumbai, India. Today, I'll be presenting on pricing farm electricity, water use, and efficiency. I would be talking about paddy cultivation in Punjab. This paper is taken from one of my dissertation chapters, and I'm, still refining some of the results and rewriting this manuscript for journal submission. So your comments and suggestions would be really useful for me today. Okay. Okay. So India is globally the largest user of groundwater for irrigation, and among all the states, Punjab is doing worse in the sense that annual groundwater extraction in Punjab exceeds its natural recharge by about 66%, according to the latest estimates given by the Central Groundwater Board. And some of the key factors contributing to the over-extraction of groundwater resources in this state are believed to be the policy of free farm electricity and the cultivation of water-intensive crops such as paddy. Let me show you some of the trends before I take you through more of context about the paper, about what I'm doing over here. So in this figure, I'm showing you how cropping patterns in the Kharif season have changed in Punjab over time. Notice that in 1970-71, there was a substantial area under maize and cotton cultivation. But over the years, the area under paddy cultivation is shown by the blue bars has gone up tremendously. And there are several reasons for changing cropping patterns, including introduction of high-yielding varieties in the Green Revolution era, expansion of tube well irrigation, which ensured more timely access to water, support price interventions, and of course, the free farm electricity policy in the state. So today I'll be focusing on the pricing of farm electricity in this state. The policy of free farm electricity was introduced in 1997. So since, after the introduction of this policy, farmers were not paying according to the actual cost of provision of electricity. They did not have an incentive to use the groundwater resources efficiently, contributing to their depletion. In fact, in one of my previous publications, I show that I actually look at the impact of this policy change, and I show that there is, at an average, there's an increase of 22% in the groundwater depths in Punjab as compared to a neighboring state where such a policy change was not introduced. This figure shows you the number of electric operated tube wells and groundwater depths over time. Notice that, the number of electric operated tube wells have gone up multifolds. And also, if you look at the groundwater depths, they've gone up by about 6 meters in 1970s and 80s to about 18 meters in, more recent time periods. So there has been, a jump in the groundwater depth. So while a switch from free electricity to volumetric pricing of farm electricity is expected to reduce the pumping of water, there are no such estimates of the magnitude of reduction in water use that might be expected if there is really a switch from free to volumetric pricing. Although several studies have highlighted that the volumetric pricing cannot be put in place because that would be politically infeasible, or that would have negative implications, especially for smaller farmers. Today, I will offer you a policy framework wherein I will show you what happens when we price electricity and what can be done in order to keep farmers' welfare unchanged in terms of offering them cash incentives within the system rather than offering some subsidies from the outside. So there are broadly two objectives of this paper. The first one is to estimate the reduction in groundwater pumping under volumetric pricing of farm electricity. So I would do this using production function estimation, which would be used to get at the estimates of the marginal product of water. And I would be using these to compute the optimal level of water use at different levels of electricity prices. I would also quantify what would be the change in other inputs and paddy yields due to unit price induced reduction in water pumping. So this is sort of a simulation exercise that I would be showing you. And the second objective would be to quantify the lump sum transfer to keep the farmer's welfare unchanged. And I would also be quantifying the gains in efficiency. So now electricity is free, and the moment we price electricity closer to the provision of the cost of electricity, there would be gains in efficiency in terms of reduction of the dead weight loss, and possibly I'll talk a little bit about that. Okay. So the primary source of data here is the cost of cultivation surveys, which is collected by the Ministry of Agriculture using a 3-state stratified sampling design. It is a 3-year rotating panel, and this data set provides information on output produced and several inputs such as labor, machine, fertilizers, insecticide, seeds, etc. And everything is given in both physical as well as monetary units. This portion of the data is publicly available, but there is, a host of data or information over here that's not publicly available and that was requested by us from the ministry. For instance, data on irrigation hours by pump type and horsepower rating. This is, an important data that could be used for computing the water variable that goes into my production function, and I'll discuss that in a bit. That's sort of not publicly available data set. In this analysis, I have used data for paddy cultivation for the period 2011-12 to 2013-14. This is a block period of 3 years for which I had requested the data. And when I started off this work, that was the most recent data set that was available. I would be doing a parcel level analysis over here. I'm not getting into intricacies as to, why not plot and why parcel, and I can take that up later on. The sample is an unbalanced panel, which has about 504 parcels on which paddy is cultivated by 238 farmers on at least one of the parcels in the 3 years that I'm looking at in this study. The second data set that I have is the data on groundwater depth taken from the Central Groundwater Board. It is an observation well level data set available for years 1995 onwards, and it records data on groundwater depths for 4 times in a year in January, April, May, August, and November. I also have data on rainfall from Matsura and Wilmot. This is a GIS gridded data set on monthly rainfall across the globe for years 1900 onwards. The resolution is 0.5 by 0.5 degrees. So this shows you how I have computed the total water use in my study. The total water use variable, as I call it, takes up water from, includes the, water from all the sources, which is amount of groundwater extracted and rainfall. Notice that over here, I've not considered canal irrigation or conjunctive use of canal and groundwater irrigation. I had data on canal irrigation charges, but those were all zeros in the data set, so that was uninformative, and I haven't considered canal irrigation here. So I have computed volume of groundwater extracted using the formula that you see on the screen. Lifting mass against gravity, in this case water, requires energy, which is power applied over time. And I use this same in order to, I just restructure the power formula to write this down. Capital IIJT is the mass of water extracted on parcel I in tehsil J in year T. That's acceleration due to gravity. This is groundwater depth in tehsil J in year T. I've considered the efficiencies of different, so I've taken assumptions around efficiencies of different kinds of pumps. I'll be showing you numbers for one set of efficiency parameters, but I have several numbers in the appendix tables in my paper. HP is the horsepower rating of the pump, and irrigation hours on the parcel are given by irrigation hours here. There are, 3 kinds of pumps, and why we take efficiency into account, because usually water pumps are not 100% efficient. And given the technological differences, diesel pumps are least efficient, while the submersibles are most efficient. Submersible pumps are also the most powerful, and we'll see that when I show you some of the summary stats. Then I compute the sea level rainfall, which is the weighted average of the grid points, which lie within the 50-kilometer area of the tehsil center. And I've taken the inverse of the distance from the tehsil center to the grid point as the weights. And I combine these 2 numbers in order to compute the total water extraction that I use in the production function. So in my sample, the average paddy yields are 65 quintals per hectare, and the average crop area is 1.75 hectares. I want you to remember this number. So the average water use is 38,000 cubic meters per hectare. And the largest contributor is the submersible pump, because most of the farmers use submersible pumps for water application. And just looking at the horsepower ratings, as I was mentioning, submersible pumps are the most powerful here, with the average horsepower of 12 HP. Again, the maximum number of parcels are actually using electric submersible pumps for water extraction. And one of the reasons is the depths are pretty deep in Punjab, so that diesel pumps or surface pumps cannot be used for water extraction. All right. So there are econometric issues pertaining to the estimation of the production function. Input used by farmers is a choice variable which depends upon various factors such as quality of land, elevation of the parcel, etc. And these factors, while they can be observed by the farmers, they are unobserved by the econometrician, and they are a part of the error term. And so input use might be correlated to this error term, which makes the input use endogenous. Now, panel data allows me to take care of the time invariant unobserved heterogeneity terms. So I have parcel fixed effects, but there still might be some omitted variables that could vary across both years as well as parcels. And to deal with this, I have used instrumental variable approach. So the endogenous inputs are instrumented using a set of variables. So one of the things that I've used is the input demand function. We know that the input prices determine the amount of inputs chosen by the farmers, and the input prices impact the output only through its impact on input choice made by the farmers. So both the conditions of relevance and exogeneity are met here. Using the data on input quantities and expenditure from the cost of cultivation data, I've computed these input prices, which are used as the instrument. Regarding the specification, I began with the translog specification, but all the interaction terms and the higher order terms basically were jointly insignificant. So I actually stuck with the Cobb-Douglas specification. Here, the left-hand side are the paddy yields on parcel I and Tehsil J near T. And on the right-hand side, I have labor, machine, water use as I computed 2 minutes back. Fertilizer, I also have insecticides and seeds. There's time fixed effects, there are parcel fixed effects. So the instruments that I've used are casual labor wages, hired machine rent, own irrigation charges. And another instrument that I also use is the groundwater depth. So there would be a negative relationship between groundwater depth and water use. So higher the groundwater depth, higher would be the unit cost of extraction of water, and low would be the water extracted. So these are the 4 instruments that I have. Let me just quickly show you what the fixed effects regressions look like. And these are not, there's no instrument over here yet. So the columns that you see, I have incrementally added various inputs. The first one just has water. The second also has labor and machine. The third adds fertilizer, and the fourth has insecticides and seeds. Notice that when I add insecticides and seeds, the coefficients of labor, machine, and water do not get altered by much. And also the coefficients are very small and insignificant. So my preferred specification is actually where I have labor, machine, water, and fertilizer. Let me get to the FEID regressions. So the first 3 columns are the first stage regressions. And, as we would expect, the coefficient on the instruments are negative and significant. I also test for the weak instrument using the Sanderson-Widmeijer statistic, and that goes through. The last column are the second stage results, which are the production function estimates that I use for estimation of the marginal product of water, and also for the simulation in my study. So this shows you, this is just the exponentiated form of the Cobb-Douglas production function that I was talking about. And differentiating this with respect to water, we get the marginal product of water. I've estimated these for all the parcels in my data set, and the average marginal product of water is about 0.34 quintals per 1,000 cubic meters of water. So just to show you what this really looks like, what I get over, so this figure plots the estimated marginal product of water for all the parcels. On the horizontal axis, I have the total water use in 1,000 cubic meters per hectare, and the marginal product of water is on the vertical axis, measured in quintals per 1,000 cubic meters of water. Now, the estimated marginal product of water at the irrigation volume chosen by the farmer is very low. As you can see, the magnitudes are small. The marginal product of water function is convex as expected, but it's relatively flat at the level of average water application. Recall that the average water application was about 38,000 cubic meters per hectare, which is somewhere here. So this implies that additional units of water increase the amount of paddy output produced per hectare by a small amount. only up to a certain threshold, maybe somewhere here. And there is no increment in the crop yields with additional units of water post that, because it becomes absolutely flat.
Disha, you have like 5 minutes max, okay?
Sure, thanks. I would be done by then. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah. So next, I estimate the reduction in water use under volumetric pricing. So what I do is that I assume that farmers are profit maximizing agents. So the unit cost of water under free farm electricity is estimated using this optimum condition, wherein I equate the unit cost of water on parcel I with the value of marginal product of water. PT is the price of the output. So let me just, probably briefly explain you how I do this. So for every unit increase in the price of electricity, it translates into the incremental cost of water extraction. Just to, simply illustrate this, suppose that the price of electricity goes up by rupee 1 per kilowatt hour. Now 1 HP is roughly equivalent to 2.75 kilowatts. So this would translate into rupees 4 per hour for extraction using a 5 HP centrifugal pump, or a rupees 9 per hour using a 12 HP submersible pump. So, from here, we know the incremental cost of water per hour, and we also know the volume of water extracted per hour using the irrigation volume formula. We can get at the incremental cost of water extraction per cubic meter. So, just to illustrate what's really happening here, initially, we are at the unit cost of water was here. So, your equilibrium was where these two curves intersected. And W was the amount of water that was used. Now, if I increase the price of electricity by 1 unit so that the price of water increases to C prime, what's really happening is that at the new equilibrium, there's a reduction in water use. Let's just look at the labor market, but there are going to be other inputs as well. So I'm just here considering 2 inputs for the sake of simplicity. The value of marginal product of labor would shift inwards, and there would be an adjustment in the amount of labor use. And so there would be an inward shift in the value of marginal product of water curve, so that there would be, a higher adjustment in the water use as compared to when there was no adjustment for the other inputs. So just to show you a summary of what I get as my simulation results, if I vary the price of electricity from 0 rupees, which is free electricity at the moment, to rupees 5.5 rupees per kilowatt hour, which corresponds to the average cost of supply of electricity during the period of study, as estimated by the Punjab State Electricity Regulatory Commission. What I really get is that the average water use declines from 33,000 cubic meters to about 9,000 cubic meters, which is a very sharp dip of 72%. And this shouldn't come as a surprise after I showed you the flat curvature of the marginal product of water curve is estimated using the actual input use data. Also notice that there is a drop in the other inputs, such as labor, machine, and fertilizer, by about 11% each. There is also a dip in the paddy yields from 65 quintals per hectare to 45 quintals per hectare, which is, large enough. It's about 30% dip. But the dip in water is much larger that I get. So further, I want to say that, when there is a pricing of electricity at 5.5 rupees per kilowatt hour, the reduction in profits of the farmers is about 10,000 rupees per hectare. And this is roughly equivalent to the earnings of the state electricity boards when electricity is priced as opposed to when it is not priced. So one could actually use a cash incentive of an equivalent amount to be given to the farmers in order to keep their welfare unchanged.
Disha, you probably need to move to conclusions now, right? You're out of your time.
Sure. Just a final statement that I want to make over here is that, while there is a dip in the yields, but there is also a decline in the input uses. And, one thing that I don't show over here is that this extra amount of inputs that could be saved from here could be used for cultivation of less water intensive crops, the strategy towards which the government is, actually trying to move. Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm sorry for taking up extra time.
No worries. You're just on time. Perfect. So Shifali is discussant for this paper. So over to you.
All right. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I really enjoyed reading the paper. Just to kind of motivate why this is such an important research question, I just wanted to put up this chart, which illustrates the average depth of the groundwater table in Punjab from 1980 to 2019. And you can see this kind of reduction in the groundwater reserves following the introduction of free electricity in 1999, 98. I mean, this is obviously descriptive, but as Disha mentioned, there's a lot of empirical evidence supporting the kind of causal relationship here as well. Another point to note is that the reason this problem is particularly challenging to fix is that farmers have long resisted power pricing and metering initiatives, not just in Punjab, but in a number of states, particularly in northern India. So I won't kind of recap the paper here. I think the approach used is, got a lot of strengths. I do want to sort of just point out a few comments that I have. So I think it's firstly a very well-written paper that puts together this very granular parcel level panel data set on agricultural inputs and outputs, rainfall and groundwater use, which can be used to answer a number of policy relevant questions. The one sort of kind of critique that I have of the paper is that the simulations assume that the use of other inputs wouldn't change with a change in the electricity price, and that's kind of mentioned in the paper as well. But you can imagine that a higher electricity price could increase the machine rental rate, which could reduce the use of machine labor and water use, which is actually shown in table 4 in I think the fixed effects regressions with the IV, and that could also potentially drive down yields. So that might sort of kind of counter some of the main findings from the simulation results. So I think a partial equilibrium framework that doesn't really account for these input complementarities may be kind of inadequate to sort of pin down some of the key relationships that you're interested in exploring in this paper. So yeah. The other thing that I was interested in is whether the impacts vary across different types of farmers. I know that you're not doing a plot level analysis, but just wanted to know if you see any distributional impacts based on whether these are smallholder farmers or or larger farmers. And I know there's quite a bit of heterogeneity in Punjab. Also wanted to know whether farmers also trade water. I know you mentioned most of them have their own pumps, but I wonder whether trading water is also a phenomenon that you see in this region, and whether farmers that sort of kind of buy water from their neighboring farms might be impacted differently by the sort of volumetric price. I think applying a volumetric price on electricity could also affect the extensive margin of crop choice. So maybe there's some shift away from water intensive crops, and so I wondered if that's something that you could also explore in the paper. What I really like about the paper is that I think you really, take seriously the political feasibility of this policy. I think governments need alternatives to inefficient policies that can compensate those who currently benefit from them. So for example, without compensation, higher power prices could lead to more default on, bill payments. And so I think, this paper very nicely computes the lump sum transfer to farmers that would leave their surplus unchanged as a result of the policy. And it shows that it would be lower than the amount that would need to be compensated to the state electricity board for the losses incurred as a result of providing free power supply to farmers. One other kind of critique I have is that, to control costs, the state electricity board in Punjab engages in 4 to 8 hours of rationing per day, but the welfare analysis in the paper doesn't account for rationing. I think to the extent that volumetric pricing increases cost recovery and that reduces rationing, farmer surplus could actually increase as a result of the policy. And so that might be something that you could kind of take into account in the welfare analysis. Just as an aside, I'm kind of very interested in dynamic pricing, as you can tell. And so I think that there's this kind of further efficiency loss from, having a fixed retail price for electricity. And so I wonder if in a counterfactual, you can explore how a dynamic retail price or reward for saving electricity at peak times could lead to even larger welfare gains from the policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Shafali. We have 1 minute if there is any question that can be asked to
Shafali, I'll
Nisha.
write my replies to your comments, but do share your slides. Thank you very much for the
Yes, I will.
Okay, things like there is no questions. So Justice, you're the last presenter, but not the least, of course. So over to you.
Okay, I believe you can hear and see my slide. So, given that Jeff Jennings it's up with his policing skills, I'm going to go straight.
Yeah, I woke up.
So, this is John Webb with my colleagues. But basically, it's the paper is on. We call it agricultural windfalls and electrification. Look, so I think everyone in this room is familiar with the challenges of expanding access to electricity, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And there's been quite a bit of evidence trying to understand what are some of the reasons why. And I think you could summarize these reasons into basically demand and supply side constraints. And along the demand side, the main issue is that the connection cost oftentimes tends to be high relative to the income levels of many households in the region. But beside that, it's also due to the irregular flow of income by these households, mostly in rural Africa. And on top of this, or probably the cherry on the cake, is that elsewhere in the developed world, where you could have easy access to credit and then pay back your debt whenever you get money, there are credit constraints in these environment. And so then the question will be like, well, given that policymakers know that importance of electricity, one option is, can't we just dole out electricity for free for people? Well, the answer is not exactly, because electricity is capital intensive, right? And so utilities will need to be able to operate them efficiently to be able to recoup their investments. And so this then brings more or less a conundrum for policymakers, right? Really, in terms of what are the optimal strategies that could be used to, enhance, access to electricity. And I think there are a bunch of papers that have looked at how offering subsidies to households in rural Africa could incentivize them to, connect to electricity and what have you. The approach we take in this paper is to say, well, we all know that there are limits to, how much subsidies can be applied, right? But aside subsidies, are there other mechanisms that could be exploited to, enhance electrification? And one of what we are looking at is agricultural windfalls, right? So think of like places where agricultural households get, unexpected windfalls from, say, the production of cash crops, right? And in this context, we are looking at coffee. And is there a mechanism in which we could think of how these houses could use these rainfalls to be able to then pay for the upfront cost of electricity connection? And then maybe conditional on connection, will it in any way affect their demand for, electricity consumption? And so what we're trying to do in this paper is to show to what extent does windfalls from agriculture or from cash crop production could actually help households to demand electricity. So on the extensive margin, we are looking at connection, and then the intensive margin, we're looking at consumption. And then we try to find some evidence in terms of potential explanations. So let me take you to the context. The context is Rwanda, and the commodity we are looking at is coffee, right? So left-hand side, this is data from the WDI that shows the trends in electrification rates in Rwanda as a share of the population. And as you've seen, it's increased quite a lot. On the right-hand side, this is the number of grid connections per year. So the blue one The red ones is the total annual connections per year. The blue line is the price of coffee on the international market, right? And as you can see, there's some level of co-movement in there. Everything here is purely correlational at this point, right? But at least there seems to be some co-movement in the, between the price of coffee and then the number of electricity connections. Again, so this is the connection rate, and I must mention everything here is great, right? There could be other things in terms of good connection, but everything here is great. This is how Rwanda looked like, and this is at the municipality level. And if you're familiar with Rwanda, they call it sectors, but this is the third administrative region within Rwanda. So the connection rate has changed quite a lot from 2000 to 2019. All right, so what sort of data we are using? So we have data on administrative billing records of the universe of electricity customers in Rwanda. And this data has detailed information on the day, the time each person was connected to electricity. And then we also know the transaction level, and we know the location and even the type of purchase. One thing that I must mention is that Rwanda is one of the countries that have done extremely well in migrating customers from postpaid to prepaid. So almost the universe of all residential and non-residential customers are on prepaid, with the exception of very large industries, which don't appear in our data sets. All right, so we combine, so we use this data to construct the connection, the panel data on the connection rate at the municipality level. We combine that with coffee cultivation intensity at the baseline, which is 1999. Our analysis starts from 2000. We use data on the international price of coffee, and then we also amend this with some data from the DHS just to understand some mechanisms. In terms of identification strategy, similar to what you see in all papers that looked at these commodity price shocks, basically we exploit temporal variations in international price of coffee, and then combine that with our baseline coffee intensity to estimate our effect. And argument is that variations in international price of coffee is plausibly exogenous because Rwanda is not a major producer of coffee, and so coffee farmers in the country are basically price takers in this. So essentially here we are interacting the baseline coffee intensity with the coffee price. We control for some baseline characteristics interacting with time trends to observe some contemporaneous changes in local economic development, which might be correlated with electricity. We control for municipality, year, and then province specific time trends. And the final thing that I must say here is that, so our outcome variable is essentially the number of connections per year per 1,000 people in the municipality. And given that it's account data, to avoid any of these issues, we use the Poisson-Quasar maximum likelihood estimator, which is seen to be a very consistent estimator in the presence of high dimensional fixed effect. All right, so let's go to the results. So I'm going to present to you the results on the extensive margin, which is how does the coffee price shock affect demand for electricity connection? And then I'll go to the intensive margin, which is essentially conditional on connection. Does it have any effect on your consumption? And then I'll wrap up with some potential explanations underlying the results. All right, so in terms of the extensive margin, this is where we try to look at whether the coffee price shocks really have any effect on demand for electricity connection. And given the rich data of our data sets, we look at three key segments. So column 1 to 3 is really considering all types of connection, which is a combination of residential and non-residential. Columns 4 to 6 is where we focus solely on residential, and 7 to 9 is where we focus on non-residential connections. And as you can see across the various specification and then even the various fixed effect combinations, we seem to have find a strong positive relationship between the coffee price shocks and the number of connections per year. To put this into some perspective, what our results are showing is that a 10% increase in coffee price shocks, if you consider the average municipality, it translates to about 1.3% increase in the electrification rate. Now, someone will say, well, okay, so over the past 20 years or so, to what extent can we quantify the extent to which coffee price increases over the period have explained the changes in electrification rate in Rwanda? And the answer is yes. So here we do some counterfactual simulations. And what we do here is that essentially what we find is that over the period, the coffee price increased about 20%, and that explains overall about 4% of the overall increase in electrification in Rwanda. Now, at this point, I know you might have a lot of questions that, hey, to what extent can you really convince me that these effects are really due to coffee and not due to any other things, right? And so I'm going to show you some evidence to kind of support our claim here. The first thing is really someone will say, look, how can you disentangle demand and supply issues? Because the observed electrification rate that we are picking up, it's interaction between demand and supply, right? The infrastructure must be there and then people must demand. And so what is share of your resources explained by, say, expansion electrification infrastructure versus a pure demand side? Our claim is that the effects we are picking up here is really due to, the demand side. And so I'm going to show you that. And then we also do some placebo tests. So now let's start with the first question. Is it a demand side story or is it a supply side story? Oh, well, if our argument is that if really it's a demand side story, then the first thing we're going to show you is that it shouldn't have any effect on uptake, right? If indeed the coffee price is actually leading to an increase in the supply of infrastructure and not that people are actually paying for connection, then it shouldn't have any effect on uptake. And just to refresh our minds, uptake is really the conditional on the infrastructure being available. What is the share of the households that are actually connected, right? And so what we do is that we use the DHS, restrict the sample to places where we know the infrastructure is there, which is essentially at least having one customer having connected to electricity. And then we look at the association between the price shock and the connection rate or the uptake. And we find, a positive effect. Then the second one is we try to look at whether there's any strategic discrimination between coffee intensive and non-coffee intensive municipalities in terms of infrastructure itself. An argument is that if indeed it's really due to the supply side, then we shouldn't find any effect on uptake. And then secondly, that the infrastructure should be skewed in favor of places or municipalities with high coffee intensity. So this is the results on uptake, right? So again, this is conditional on having infrastructure available. Now you will see for rural communities, which is essentially where we expect the effect to be, because that's where coffee is being grown, right? Conditional on the infrastructure being available, we find a positive association between the coffee price shock and the take-up of electricity, right? Now, if you put everything together, rural and urban, the effect dies out. And for me, this is not an invalidation of our resources, really that the effect that we are looking at for it should be more present in rural communities. The second one is the question of whether there's any strategic discrimination between coffee and non-coffee growing areas in terms of the rollout of the infrastructure. Ideally, we will have wished that we have time series data on the rollout of the infrastructure over time, but we don't. But we have snapshot of the data of the grid infrastructure as of 2018, which is like 1 year before the end of our sample, which gives us the stock of the electricity infrastructure across the various municipalities. And so what we try to do is that let's do a cross-sectional correlation between the coffee intensity and then the grid network, the length of the grid lines within each municipality, as well as the density. We also have the number of transformers, as well as the density of the transformers. And we don't find any strong correlation. And if column 4 is to go by, in fact, what we are even finding is that places with high coffee intensity have less availability of the infrastructure, right? So it's not as if that the government is strategically sending more infrastructure into the coffee growing areas, which is why we are picking up the positive effect. And if anything is the opposite, but our overall conclusion here is that we don't find any evidence of strategic discrimination between coffee and non-coffee growing areas as regards to the supply infrastructure. Another placebo test we do here, it's really someone will say, well, maybe the coffee intensity is correlated with some unobservable things that could be changing over time. And so maybe the effect you are picking is not really due to coffee. And so here we do some simulation where we randomly assign municipalities to with some random numbers of baseline coffee intensity. And the effect is that, so these are the plots of the estimates from the simulation, and the vertical line is our baseline. Not even in one instance do we find any of the simulated effects similar or even greater than our baseline estimate. We do leave one out. The result is not sensitive to a specific district. So now we go to the intensive margin, which is really conditional on connection. What does coffee price shocks help you, have any effect on consumption? And I must say one thing that is important here is that note that everybody here is on prepaid, right? And with prepaid, what it means is that the constraint is really binding. You only consume when you have the money to pay, right? And so if you don't have money to pay, you probably don't consume any electricity, right? And so we're looking at how do these coffee price shock encourage people or affect people's demand for purchasing electricity? And so again, here we look at the expenditure, which is the monetary value of how much each household is buying at a particular point in time, so per month, per quarter, and then the quantity, which is the kilowatt of consumption, and we do find a positive effect across. Again, our effect is really peculiar to rural communities, all right, which is again where a lot of the coffee activities is going on in the country. I mentioned about prepaid, but then, so you have prepaid and then you also have incremental block tariff, right? And if we know with incremental block tariff, the more you buy electricity, you move from a low marginal cost to a higher marginal cost, right? And so the question is, when people have enough income, they will be able to plan very well their consumption. They will know what the optimal levels of consumption so that they stay within the block and not buy, because the more you buy, you might buy more and then end up in a higher marginal cost band. And so what we're trying to look at here is try to understand how does the coffee price shock influence the purchasing behavior of households. So we know the frequency of electricity purchase, right, per quarter. We also know the quantity of purchase. And what we do see here is that associated with lower price of the associated with lower frequency of purchase. So when people have money, they're able to, and if they have the money, they can actually buy in bulk and store, because once you buy the electricity, it stays on your meter and they can consume it at any point in time, even when you don't have income.
Justice, you have about 5 minutes.
Okay.
Just to let you know.
Okay. So up to this point, I've presented to you the results on the extensive and then the intensive margin. The question is, what could be the potential explanations, right? Obviously, we advanced two main channels or explanations. Our first point is that the coffee price shocks allow households to relax their liquidity constraints, right? It's a low-income environment, and then they are facing, myriads of challenges. But then once people have these income shock, it allows them to actually overcome the cost of paying for an upfront cost of electricity connections, right? And we are going to show you evidence on that. Now, on the intensive margin, we show that with a coffee price shock, it allows households to actually pay for buy electrical appliances, because electricity, as you know, is a derived demand. Nobody consumes electricity directly. On this call, we are using electricity, but we are using electricity through our appliances, right? And so our argument is that the channel for the consumption part is really through the demand for electrical appliances. Now, let's start with the liquidity constraint story. So our sample period is 2000 to 2019, but then in 2017, the Rwandan government decided to remove the requirement for upfront cost, the payment of the upfront cost of connection, right? And instead said, okay, even if a household does not have the money to pay upfront, they can still be connected, but then allow them to pay the connection fee each time they buy electricity. So each time you buy electricity, 50% of the amount you are paying is used to defray your cost, right? So more or less like an installment purchase. Now, our argument is that if the story is really about the liquidity constraint, the papers is really about liquidity constraint, then we shouldn't find a strong effect in the period after 2017, because then by that time, the requirement for upfront, the payment of the full upfront fee is no longer there. And so to show that, what we do is that we interact our price shock with a dummy for the period for which the policy was in full force, right? So what you see here is that if the coefficient is positive, but it's very small. So the first part is essentially the effect of the price shock in the absence of the policy, when people were forced to pay the full upfront cost. And the second one is the difference between, the pre and post, right? And so what we are seeing here is that, in fact, in almost all our preferred specification, which is columns 3, 6, and 9, what we find is that once the policy was in full force, we don't even find any significant effect of the coffee price shock on demand for electricity connection, which speaks to our point that what the coffee price were actually doing was helping households alleviate the liquidity constraint problem that they were facing before. We also show that still on it, in terms of it, there's a positive effect on employment, and employment obviously will lead to household incomes, and that allow them to demand for or pay for electricity connections. The last point here is that this is an extension, and this is something that we are still thinking through. Within the sample period, the government also then implemented a program that led to the establishment of coffee mills, which is essentially a value addition, to allow households to earn more money, like in their coffee, because they're able to add value before selling it at the bureaus. And so what we show here is that the introduction of the coffee mills in the municipalities is associated with a positive increase in the demand for electrification. And the final thing on the mechanism before my time is up, is that we show that there's a positive increase in demand for electrical appliances. So just to conclude, basically what we're showing here is that it's a strategy to demand to increase electricity connection. What countries could also do is potentially try to see how they could harness price shocks from tradables, right? These commodity prices. Think of timing electrification connection programs to the time of harvest in places that have of these cash crops, because that's when households may potentially have some transitory income to be able to demand or make this lumpy investment. I think my time is up, so I'll stop here. Thanks.
Your time is up, and you're right on time, Justice. Congratulations. Excellent timing. That's what the World Bank people do, okay, look, Disha, you are the last but not least here. So please tell Justice all the best things about these papers and also the worst.
Well, I'm gonna say all the nice things. So congratulations, Justice, with a nice presentation and a nice paper too. I mean, I want to, just start by saying that it's a well-written paper, and it's an interesting question wherein you look at the commodity price shocks and the association with the electrification. What I really want to say is that the way he presented, answering all the questions, all possible questions that could have been, is really the way the paper also has been written. So yeah, it's in, most of the stuff is in place, but there are still a few comments that I would want to make. So I was wondering that apart from coffee, could you also consider price shocks in the case of some other crops in the region just for robustness? Like, I understand that, coffee is a dominant, but in order to just do a robustness and see what's happening when there are price shocks with regard to other commodities, what are the kind of results that you get? Secondly, I was wondering whether, controlling for the international prices of some substitutes or complements of coffee, would create a potential impact on the way you've considered your coffee intensity. So, so you may want to take that into account, because the way you've modeled it right now, you don't have the prices of other commodities that might be having an impact on the coffee intensity variable, and that might be important. Thirdly, you've clustered standard errors at the level of municipality, as far as I recall. You also have some spatial data, and I believe when it comes to price shocks, there also might be some spatial correlation out there. So you may want to, and this is an easy to do exercise, and before the referees ask you to do it, it's better that you just put in some Conley kind of standard errors or some other spatial correlation in place in your paper. Just a minor typo that I want to point out. Below equation 1, you've written an explanation. There you've used different notation for province, while writing fixed effects, and while writing the interaction term, you've used different notations, and you may want to correct for that. That's about it. Short and sweet, so that everybody can leave, and it's the last presentation of the session. And thank you so much, Justice. It was a great presentation, and it's great work. All the best to you for publishing this.
Well,
Thank you.
Anton Chekhov once said that brevity is the mother of talent, and I enthusiastically agree with that. So I appreciate being up to the point. So Mark, before departing, sent a very interesting comment. He said that you probably need to look at the paper at Ferrer and Usmani on guar price and electrification complementarity in India. I guess the paper could be quite relevant to what you do here, Justice. So we're pretty good on time. I may have rushed a little bit, but I didn't know that everyone is so proficient at the end. Usually the people in the end are getting the most stressed, right? So I wanted to avoid that situation at all cost. Given that I'm usually presenting the last, so I'm when I'm at the conferences. So I like to punish the first and then reward the last presenters. Any questions from the auditorium? Any last minute questions? Okay, so this is great. And thanks, 3 great presenters
So,
for the wonderful. The question, or
if I may respond, and I probably
yes,
need
please
some
do.
guidance.
We still have like several minutes.
So, Adisha, on the spatial correlation, yeah, it's something that I've been thinking about. The problem that I'm facing now, and happy to get ideas, it's the Conley, all the packages available for Conley is not available. It's only for the OLS. We don't have the version, at least I haven't seen the version for the Poisson. And so I've been looking around to see if any of the geniuses have written a package for, that allows you to estimate Conley's, standard errors for, like, even when you estimate as a Poisson. And if any of you do, please, I'll really appreciate it. If you can, share with me.
So I won't be genius here, but what I read in the literature last time, the Conley as a concept has been heavily pounded in the literature. This is a completely bogus way of doing things. There is a very nice paper in GP, by O'Hara and colleagues, basically saying that Conley shouldn't be used any longer. It's super suspicious, right? So if you want to control for spatial autocorrelation, you probably want to explicitly incorporate spatial lags if possible, right? Or cluster, either way. But it seems like literature moved to Conley per se at this particular point of time. So I guess it will save you some work.
Okay. But if any of you have ideas about how to deal with that spatial problem, please reach out. I really appreciate it.
Sure. So thanks everyone. And before we adjourn, there are still 2 other parallel sessions going on. So our was a little bit shorter. So you can move to, if you want to kind of use this time, you can move to session A1 or session A3, which will still have 1 presentation going. And I think that would be interesting. Okay. Well, again, thank you very much. This was super good panel. I'm sorry for being a bit late, but nonetheless, we all survived and we did well. So thanks so much, and see you at the next event. Take care.
Thank you.
Clap, clap, clap. Bye-bye.